right, good evening, First Baptist Church. It's good to see you all this evening. If y'all would stand, look who's back. Miss Ann is back. I know y'all are excited. I know I'm excited about it. She's going to lead us in some worship this evening. So y'all sing out with us.
So if I run out of breath, y'all just keep on singing. I love to tell the story of unseen things above, of Jesus and His glory, of Jesus and His love. I love to tell the story because I know 'tis true. It satisfies my longings as nothing else can do. I love to tell the story. 'Twill be my theme and glory to tell the old story of Jesus and His love. I love to tell the story. It's pleasant to repeat what seems each time I tell it more wonderfully sweet. I love to tell the story, for some have never heard the message of salvation from God's unholy word. I love to tell the story of those who know Him best, seems hungering and thirsty to Jesus and His love. I love to tell the story for those who know it best, seem hungering and thirsty to hear it like the rest.
All right, the chorus.
I love to tell the story. 'Twill be my theme and glory to tell the old story of Jesus and His love. To tell the old story of Jesus and His love. They call that brain fog for us COVID people.
No, I think I'm jinxed. Do you know what it's been like the last few weeks me getting up here?
34 days quarantine, and I'm still not all here.
Hey, listen, he only said make a joyful noise. That's what he
right.
said.
And there
can do
is
that.
coming a day when none of us have to worry about
That's
this
right.
anymore.
That's
I'm sure we'll be glad. There is coming a day when no heartache shall come, no more clouds in the sky, no more tears to dim the eye. All is peace forevermore on that happy golden shore. What a day, glorious day that will be. What a day
glorious day that will be. What a day that will be when my Jesus I shall see. When I look upon his face, the one who saved me by his grace. When he takes me by the hand and leads me through the promised land. What a day, glorious day that will be. What a day, glorious day that will be. Amen.
Amen. All right, you may be seated.
Amen. I was telling somebody earlier something that I say more and more often. In 100 years, none of this will matter. It's amazing how we spend so much time worrying about things that don't last. Okay, all right. Thank you, ladies. I'm so thankful, Ann, that you're back tonight. You did a great job. Thank you for not being dead. So she's already gone, isn't she? So bless her heart. She had a stubborn contest with COVID and won, but it was not easy for her. We are in Deuteronomy chapter 14 tonight. Or actually, we're going to start in chapter 14. We're just going to read a few verses, and then we're going to move to chapter 15. For those of you who have not been with us or watching online, Moses is in the final speech of his life before he goes up on Mount Pisgah, sees the promised land, and then God calls him home. He's about to die. He's making his final speech or giving his final words to the nation of Israel. He's addressing them all there at the foot of the mountain. And they're going to cross the Jordan after this, and he's going to go up on the mountain alone to die. And so he's making his final appeal. Parents, it's kind of like your kid's about to go off to college, and you don't have any control over what they're going to do once they walk out that front door anymore. And so you try your best to put the fear of God in them and make that last final appeal before they leave. That's what Moses is doing. This is his last chance, and so he's doing his best to do that. As I've said before, this is kind of a bird's eye view or Reader's Digest version, if any of you know what Reader's Digest is, a condensed version of what we've seen in the rest of the Pentateuch so far. Because some of it is direct repeat, and we've studied some of this in depth already, I'll be skipping some of it only if it was repeat. Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 1, he's right in the middle of his speech. He says, "You are the children of the Lord your God. Do not cut yourselves or shave the front of your heads for the dead, for you're a people holy to the Lord your God. Out of all the peoples on the face of the earth, the Lord has chosen you to be his treasured possession." Now, what he's saying in those first two verses is, don't adopt the culture and the cultural activities of those around you. Don't behave like them. Don't develop their traditions. Verse 3, do not eat any detestable thing. And so he spends much of the rest of the chapter, and you can read it on your own. We've also studied this in depth, so I will not read through it, telling them what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. And he goes through a pretty good list of animals in the animal kingdom that they can eat and can't eat, all the way down to whether or not you can eat an eagle or a badger. And by the way, could they eat an eagle or a badger? No, they couldn't have either one of those. I don't blame them. I've never had an eagle or a badger, but it doesn't sound very appetizing to me. So he talks about that, and then he basically tells them also or reminds them they can't eat any dead things. He tells them if you come across an animal that's dead, you can't eat it, but you can sell it to a foreigner, and they can eat it. And then he also talks to them about tithing requirements, 1/10 of all that they have in terms of their flocks and their herds and their produce and that sort of thing. That belongs to the Lord, and we've looked at that also. You can go back and study that. But now I want to look in Deuteronomy chapter 15, the very next chapter, verse 1. We're going to look at verse 1 through 11, Deuteronomy 15, 1 through 11. I just found this part interesting. We've looked at this, but I want to look at it again a little more in depth. At the end of every 7 years, you must cancel debts. This is how it is to be done. Oh, yeah. Yes, this doesn't apply to Citibank, apparently. But wouldn't that be wonderful? You just call up your credit card company and say, hey, it's year 7, thanks.
That is kind of how your credit report works.
Yes, well, yeah. Yes, your credit report. If you have bad credit, it goes away in how long? 7 years. That's right. So there you go. That's a good question. I wonder where that comes from.
I think it probably comes from the indentured servant.
Yes, and we'll get to that. Yeah.
Which was popular during colonial times.
Interesting. Verse 2, this is how it's to be done. Every creditor shall cancel the loan he has made to his fellow Israelite. He shall not require payment from his fellow Israelite or brother, because the Lord's time for canceling debts has been proclaimed. You may require payment from a foreigner, but you must cancel any debt your brother owes you. However, there should be no poor among you, for in the land the Lord your God is giving you to possess as your inheritance, he will richly bless you if only you fully obey the Lord your God and are careful to follow all these commands I'm giving you today. For the Lord your God will bless you as he has promised, and you will lend to many nations, but will borrow from none. You will rule over many nations, but none will rule over you. And again, all of these statements and these promises are conditional based on whether or not they are obedient to God. And we're going to see here in the end how or what happens in the future when they are not obedient to God. And then we'll look at just a few of those verses that I just read here in a minute. But let me finish the section. Verse 7. If there is a poor man among your brothers in any of the towns of the land that the Lord your God is giving you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted toward your poor brother. Rather, be open-handed and freely lend him whatever he needs. Be careful not to harbor this wicked thought. The 7th year, the year for canceling debts, is near, so that you do not show ill will toward your needy brother and give him nothing. He may then appeal to the Lord against you, and you will be found guilty of sin. What is he saying there? Nobody wants to lend in year 7. Not much of a good deal, you know. Verse 10, give generously to him and do so without a grudging heart. Then because of this, the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and everything you put your hand to. There will always be poor people in the land. Therefore, I command you to be open-handed toward your brothers and toward the poor and needy in your land. So he says quite a bit there. The Sabbath year involved much more than rest for the land. If you remember, in the 7th year, the land itself was to receive rest. It also meant canceling debts and setting free the servants who had served for 6 years. Bible scholars don't agree on whether the entire debt was canceled or just the interest on the loan for the year. My reading of it implies that the whole debt is canceled. So they had to cancel the debt for fellow Israelites, but not necessarily for those who were foreigners. Since people weren't getting any income from their land on that 7th year, they wouldn't be able to pay their debts easily. But what was a test of faith for some would be an answer to prayer for the poor and the needy. They were permitted to eat freely from the fields and orchards and were given an extra year to raise money to pay their debts. And so no matter how you slice it, that 7th year was a great year if you were heavily in debt. By the way, the seeming contradiction between verse 4, did you notice that? There shall be no poor among you. And verse 11, the poor will never cease in the land, is resolved by paying attention to the context. Now here's the goal. If you go back to verse 4, However, there should be no poor among you, for in the land the Lord your God is giving you to possess as your inheritance, he will richly bless you, if only you fully obey the Lord your God and are careful to follow all these commands I'm giving you today. Now, here's God's goal for them. He wants to create a society where he, God, is in control, and they, God's people, are obedient to him. Even in a fallen world, if that happens, if God's people are obedient to him, God will see to it that economically their country is in a place so that there is no poor. There are no poor. That is, we don't have to wait till we're in heaven to have a culture free or a world free of poor. All we have to do is obey God. And the more we disobey God as a species, the more poor there is among us. God was in control of them spiritually, and the effects of that spiritual relationship that he had with them and they with him, the effects of that had economic implications for their country and for them personally. That is, God's desire is that you not have to be poor or live in a society that is poor. But bad news, we are not a monotheistic culture anymore. And so there is so much corruption in our world and in our land. Don't get excited and think that God is promising you that in the midst of all of this mess of which we live, that somehow he's going to promise you that you won't be poor. That was the goal. However, in light of that goal, the reality was everybody was living in a fallen society as they were, and God said, there are going to be poor among you. Verse 7, if there is a poor man among your brothers in any of the towns, the land that the Lord God is giving you, don't be hard-hearted or tight-fisted toward your poor brother. And then he goes on to say that there will always be poor. I can't remember what verse that is. But he continues to talk about the poor and needy in the land. So, verse 11, thank you. But here's what God is saying to them. In light of the fact that some of you are going to have more than others, be generous. Now, he's not advocating a socialist government where the government forces them to be generous, to take what they earned and forcibly takes it from them and gives it to other people who are poor. That's not what he's advocating here. What he is advocating is generosity. This is somebody that's in need. Be generous. I think theologically that is a great doctrine to have today. For God's people, wherever you are financially, be generous. If you have an opportunity, doesn't mean to give away everything you have. It doesn't mean to throw your money away on whatever grifter comes along and wants to take advantage of you. But you understand the concept of being generous with other people and not being generous. And so he says, if you have an opportunity to be generous to help out others. I think that's wise and applicable as today as much as it was then. Okay, all right. The Sabbath year and the year of Jubilee were part of God's wise plan to balance the economic scales in the nation so that the rich could not exploit the poor or the poor take advantage of the rich. Had God not set this up, what would have happened so it's kind of a reset every 7 years and every 49 years. What would have happened had God not set that up? Yeah, it would just skewed worse and worse and worse and worse. And so God had this brilliant way of balancing the scales and bringing it back to a healthy place. That's fascinating. And then chapter 16, we're not going to look at it, deals with Passover and appointing judges, both of which we've covered in depth. Now, I encourage you to go back and read chapter 16 when you get an opportunity. But we have looked at both the Passover and Judges quite closely as it's been dealt with before. Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 1. Deuteronomy 17:1. We're going to look at verse 1 through 11 here as well. Do not sacrifice to the Lord your God an ox or a sheep that has any defect or flaw in it, for that would be detestable to him. If a man or a woman living among you in one of the towns the Lord gives you is found doing evil in the eyes of the Lord your God in violation of his covenant, and contrary to my command has worshipped other gods, bowing down to them, or to the sun, or to the moon, or the stars of the sky, and this has been brought to your attention, then you must investigate it thoroughly. If it is true and has been proved that this detestable thing has been done in Israel, take the man or woman who has done this evil deed to your city gate and stone that person to death. On the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, a man shall be put to death, but no one shall be put to death on the testimony of only one witness. The hands of the witnesses must be the first in putting him to death, then the hands of all the people. You must purge the evil from among you. Now he says something very interesting, and we've looked at this a little bit as well. This is God speaking about justice, and we're going to really look at justice for the rest of the study tonight. And he says, if there's somebody that you know, a man or a woman that's living among you, and by the way, in previous chapters, that we didn't look at, it even specifies that if it's your spouse or your family member, your parents, your kids, whoever it is, if they're clearly coming to you and they're saying, hey, let's follow after other gods, that is a punishable offense, punishable by death. And so he says here, if there's something that's worthy of death, you investigate it thoroughly. It's the first thing that he says. And then he says, if the sentence is death, those of you who have accused them don't get to go home and have somebody else do the dirty deed. You have to be willing to do that yourself. And so you got to be the first one to pick up the stone. And remember, Jesus used this very concept to protect and save the life of the woman that was caught in immorality, in an immoral sin, in adultery. And he said to them, let whoever here has no sin cast the first stone. And of course, they all dropped their rocks one at a time and left. So it goes all the way back to this right here. You have to take responsibility and be a part of that. And then after those who accuse them begin, then the rest of them join in. You must purge the evil from among you. That's the goal. Verse 8, if cases come before your courts that are too difficult for you to judge, whether bloodshed, lawsuits, or assaults, take them to the place the Lord your God will choose. Go to the priests, who are Levites, and to the judge who is in office at that time. Inquire of them, and they will give you the verdict. You must act according to the decisions they give you at the place the Lord will choose. Be careful to do everything they direct you to do. Now, again, justice was the goal here. And he says if it's a situation where it's a difficult judgment, it's a substantial judgment, whether it's bloodshed, lawsuits, or assaults, those are examples, then you need to take them before the Levites, the priests, and there's someone that will be appointed to judge, the appointed judge, the priest and the judge. They listen to the case and they make a decision. But he says, if you do this, you have to do what? What's the requirement? You go before the judge, you take the matter before the judges, before the Levites, and before the judge. The judge issues a verdict. What do you have to do? I'm sorry? Yeah, you have to abide by the judgment. You can't go through this process of going before the Levites and go before the judge, and they issue their judgment, and you go, that's stupid. I'm not going to do that. We're not abiding by that. And because that's our desire even today, is it not? We don't like what the judge says. That's stupid. Well, we live in a system of laws, and we have to abide by those laws. And again, all of that, in my opinion, and I'm right, can be traced back to here in Deuteronomy, where God is setting up a social system of justice. as best we can. But we have to abide by that, because if you're not willing to abide by the law, then it just becomes anarchy. And so he tells us to do that. Justice was the goal, but it required the people to be honest and faithful. Unfortunately, that didn't last. About 600 to 900 years later, we find ourselves in a place like in Habakkuk chapter 1, verse 1. So hold your place here. Go to Habakkuk 1:1. If you can find Habakkuk, it's toward the end of your Old Testament. Habakkuk is not a long book. Now, Habakkuk is not the only one that has had to deal with this injustice. Many of the prophets, if not most of them, had to deal with very similar injustices. But I like the way that Habakkuk says it, so I always use him as my reference, because this very breakdown of justice is what prompts him to write this book. Habakkuk chapter 1, verse 1. By the way, Habakkuk lived in the early 600s BC. That's significant because in his very generation, both Israel, the 10 tribes of Israel, were conquered and deported to Assyria. And in that very same generation, not long after, in 587 BC, the southern 2 tribes of Judah and Benjamin were also conquered by a different group, by the Babylonians, and they were hauled off to Babylon. He is a contemporary of Jeremiah. And so Habakkuk is giving this cry to God about justice. In chapter 1, verse 1 says, the oracle that Habakkuk the prophet received, and here's the oracle. How long, O Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen, or cry out to you violence, but you do not save? Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you, God, tolerate wrong? That's an accusation, is it not? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and conflict abound. Therefore, the law is paralyzed, and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous, so that justice is perverted. And I always say this about Habakkuk. His first complaint to God isn't just that there's injustice in the land. His first complaint to God is, why do you make me look at this injustice? Did you notice that? I'm tired of seeing it. Why do you throw this in my face? I don't want to look at it anymore. I don't want to see this. It's depressing me. And the justice system that we just looked at, that was set up and established in Deuteronomy, has at this point collapsed, to the point that Habakkuk says, if you notice, he says, the law is paralyzed and justice never prevails. I don't know what you think about the justice system in our country. It is flawed, just like every justice system, because it is orchestrated by human beings, and human beings are flawed. We always hear and see about that case where this obviously guilty person gets away with murder, and then we see in the news these cases where people who were ultimately known to be innocent spent decades in jail because of a false conviction. We see these injustices constantly, and it is constantly stirring up our nation and in our world, because we want justice. Mostly we want justice for ourselves, or unless we do something wrong, then we want mercy. I want justice concerning you and mercy concerning me. Anyway, but this is Habakkuk saying it's not working at all. There's never one case, God, where I go, yeah, that was okay. That worked out pretty good. That's a good call. Habakkuk is saying it never happens. There was such corruption in his land with the officials and with the government and those who were supposed to be rendering justice, so that it had collapsed and it was just all wicked and all wrong. So that's the first thing he says is, why do you make me look at injustice? I know how he feels. Somebody flies by you on the interstate, and you think, where are the police when I need them? And then 30 minutes later, a policeman stops you and gives you a ticket. We go from Habakkuk to needing mercy very quickly. We see injustice in our life, do we not? We encounter that. We live through that. Although, let's be fair, most of the time your injustices and my injustices are not that bad. We think they're awful. But there are many nations in this world where terrible injustices happen every day. In Afghanistan, where somebody can walk out on the street and be walking down the street and be executed right there and nobody does anything about it. There are places in our world, and there are many places in our world, where atrocities are committed all the time and nobody is there to provide justice. That's where Habakkuk is. What did he want? He wanted to be spared from what he witnessed to be injustice. In history and in biblical times as well, but since then even, throughout the centuries, conquered kings, when their countries were overrun and their cities were overthrown, the kings were often dragged outside the city to be executed. But before they were executed, they were forced to watch the executions of their families and loved ones. Horrible, horrible things, so that the last thing they saw in their life were those terrible injustices that were taking place. So he says this to God and makes this accusation. Did you see it? Why do you tolerate wrong? Now, I hear that a lot here in the 21st century. And maybe we cry out to God and say something very similar. God, don't you watch the news? Why do you allow this to happen? For, of course, God would say that what we do when we disobey him is also not justice. If we receive justice, then we would go to judgment. But again, we want mercy for us and justice elsewhere. But it is hard to watch these terrible atrocities taking place. And it is tempting to say, God, don't you notice this? Why are you allowing this to happen? I'm reminded that God sees on a level that we don't see, but also in a timing that we don't see. We assume that God, and this is the assumption of Habakkuk, that God is tolerating injustice because Habakkuk wants justice, but he wants justice quickly. And by quickly, in his own lifetime. He doesn't want to wait a generation or two. He won't be here anymore. He wants to know that God has brought justice right here and right now. And by the way, let me encourage you a little bit, if this is encouragement. For all the atrocities that are committed in this world, God is not blind or deaf. He sees what has happened. He knows those who are cruel and brutal and barbaric, and every single one of them, apart from his mercy, God will bring about justice. They may not go to prison here, but God will take care of it in his way. And so he makes this accusation, why do you tolerate wrong? In Job chapter 24, verse 12, Job felt the same way. He says this, the groans of the dying rise from the city, and the souls of the wounded cry out for help, but God charges no one with wrongdoing. His implication is God is just turning a deaf ear. Now, Job knew better, and he learned better, but he made that accusation. I think Habakkuk, and maybe even Job, and possibly even you and me, are ultimately saying this to God. We don't say it in these words, but we're putting ourselves in this position. God, if I were in charge, I would do such and such. If I were in charge, I would not permit this injustice over here or what I saw in the news. And by the way, our pitiful, feeble little window into the world from CNN or ABC or Fox News or whatever is nothing compared to what's really going on in our world, in every household, in every nation, on every continent. God sees it all. All the injustices that never get reported, God sees all of those. And so it's audacious for us to say, if I were in charge, if we were in charge, we wouldn't have a clue. But that's what we think. God, can I give you some advice? I think you should get that Taliban. Like God needs our advice. Well, God gives an answer to Habakkuk and ultimately to you and me. His answer is in verse 5 through 11 of Habakkuk chapter 1. Look there with me. Habakkuk 1 verse 5. It's a great response. This is verse 5 through 11. Look at the nations and watch and be utterly amazed. This is God speaking. For I'm going to do something in your days that you would not believe even if you were told. I am raising up the Babylonians, that ruthless and impetuous people who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwelling places not their own. They are a feared and dreaded people. They are a law to themselves and promote their own honor. Their horses are swifter than leopards, fiercer than wolves at dusk. Their cavalry gallops headlong. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like a vulture swooping to devour. They all come bent on violence. Their hordes advance like a desert wind and gather prisoners like sand. They deride kings and scoff at rulers. They laugh at all fortified cities. They build earthen ramps and capture them. Then they sweep past like the wind and go on. Guilty men whose own strength is their God. Now, ultimately, he's in the beginning of a conversation with Habakkuk, and he's telling Habakkuk, let me tell you what I'm going to do. Before I tell you, you're not going to believe it. I'm sending the Babylonians. You want to see justice? You're going to see justice because all those people you see doing bad things, they're all going to be dead. I'm going to sweep through. And this is the problem of the day of Habakkuk. It was a corrupt society. They had abandoned the teachings that we see in Deuteronomy. God had set up a system of justice, and it was so broken and so bent because the people were so corrupt, it was paralyzed. It wasn't working anymore. And God says, because you're not willing to do this as a nation, I'm going to judge you as a nation, and I'm going to send the Babylonians. And he spends the rest of this part of this passage just trying to terrify them about the Babylonians. I mean, he talks about they're ruthless, they're horrible, and they sweep through like a plague, and their horses and on and on. And he says, I'm sending them, and they're going to sweep through, and they're going to wipe you out. Which, by the way, did that happen? Yeah, it happened. And God says, you want justice? I'm going to give you justice. I don't think that's what you really want, but that's what you're going to get. And in fact, it's going to be so swift and so powerful, you won't even believe it until you see it. So I don't know how God's going to wrap this all up here in the 21st century. The atrocities committed against Christians in places like North Korea, places like Afghanistan, where there are no doubt missionaries that are suffering terribly, but in so many nations in our world, Christian pastors and followers in China that are being imprisoned or rotting in prison right now quietly. God's watching, and he's going to take care of it. Look back with me to Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 12, and we're going to look at verse 12 and 13 and in for tonight. It comes with a warning. The man who shows contempt for the judge or for the priest who stands ministering there to the Lord your God must be put to death. You must purge the evil from Israel. All the people will hear and be afraid and will not be contemptuous again. So here's what God is saying. I'm setting up a justice system where he says, for the guilty, those who do wrong, that you must purge the evil from your nation. And if they're found guilty, then there is capital punishment for them. They're to be executed. But he also says this from the other side of the coin. He says, for those of you who don't listen to the judge, who just dismiss what he has to say, you also are the evil that must be purged from this country, because God desired for there to be justice. In this nation, the United States, I promise you, God is not neutral. He desires for there to be justice here. I'm not sure we want justice, though. Do we really want justice? Of course, again, we want mercy for ourselves. We want justice concerning everybody else. And we're all this way. It doesn't matter if you're a good church-going, Bible-believing, Southern Baptist Christian, or you're an atheist living in Hollywood, a progressive living in New York. You're a member of Antifa, or you're a member of the Ku Klux Klan. Everybody, I've told you this before, we all think we're righteous and we're deserving and everybody else is undeserving. But God sees beyond all of that. He knows your heart and my heart. He knows what we think and what we do. We can't fool God. So when we cry out for justice, just as the people were crying out for justice, God was saying, look, you're all pretty corrupt. I'm just going to wipe you all out. Ugh. It's not the solution I have in mind, is it? When I want God to bring justice in the United States, of course, I'm talking about those awful Democrats, not us good, righteous Republicans, right? Or however you want to say it, or slice it or dice it. We always paint ourselves as the righteous and those people, whoever those people are, as the unrighteous, just as they do concerning us. But there is a judge, a perfect judge. He knows the hearts of men. He knows right or wrong. He is the very definition of what is good, and God will bring about righteousness in his way and in his time. And it will be irrefutable. All right, any other comments or questions about our passage for tonight? Yes, Greg. Justice and what?
Justice is mine. I will.
Yes, justice is mine and I will repay, ... I always say that because we forget the last part of that verse. Thus saith the Lord. Yeah, that's a really important part, but that's exactly right. That's what it says. It is for God will give justice. There will never be a single injustice permitted by God unless they are under the mercy of God through the blood of Jesus Christ. That is the only way to get around justice. Yes?
So you had mentioned that, kind of mulling over this since we're talking about the Sabbath years and all that. That was even part of the reasons for the captivity, was that God said they never let the land rest.
Yeah, you're right. That's just one of many. Yeah, there was just a general breakdown that they didn't let the land rest. They probably got to where they didn't cancel debts or release servants or whatever they were supposed to. They didn't do what they were supposed to do, and it all broke down, and so God just
said, you owe me 70 years.
Yeah. And so even at the 70 years, yeah, and so that's what happened. He sent them into judgment. That's exactly right. All right, anybody else? Okay, let's stop right there. Thank you for your comments, and we'll take up in Deuteronomy chapter 17 next week. Take a look at your prayer sheet for the week. If you need a prayer sheet, raise your hand.